You're at a gathering, maybe a party, a work event, a dinner with people you've known for years. There's noise. There's laughter. Someone near you is telling a story and the room responds, and you're there, physically present, nodding at the right moments, even smiling. But underneath all of it, quietly, almost imperceptibly, you are somewhere else entirely, watching from just behind your own eyes, waiting for it to be over. And the strangest part isn't the feeling itself. The strangest part is that you can't explain it, because these aren't bad people. This isn't a bad night. You chose to be here. And yet the loneliness, the particular kind that arrives in crowds, is sharper than anything you feel when you're actually alone. There's a reason for that. And it has nothing to do with how social you are or how much you like the people in the room. It has to do with something much quieter. Something the brain does when the gap between who you are and who you're performing becomes too wide to ignore. Let's slow this down. Think about what actually happens in those rooms. You walk in. Somewhere in the first few seconds, a version of you activates. This version knows the right register to speak in, knows how to be warm without being overwhelming, knows how to laugh at the right volume, knows how to seem present. It's not fake exactly. It's more like a carefully edited version of you. The parts that feel safe to show. The parts that won't confuse anyone. The parts that keep the interaction smooth. And for a while that version carries the evening. But somewhere around the hour mark, or maybe sooner if the room is loud, if the conversation stays on the surface, if you've had to explain yourself 3 times and still feel like no one quite landed on who you are, the effort starts to show its weight. You find yourself drifting mid-conversation, nodding but not listening, laughing but not feeling it. And underneath the performance, something very specific is happening. The real you, the one with the actual opinions, the actual humor, the actual way of seeing things has gone quiet. Not because it doesn't want to be known. Because it's learned slowly and across many rooms that showing up fully is a complicated risk. That being too much, too intense, too honest, too strange, creates a particular kind of silence in other people. The kind that tells you you've miscalibrated. So you calibrate. Constantly. You read the room, adjust the signal, manage the output. And by the end of the night, you've been surrounded by people, and genuinely touched by none of them. Not because the connection wasn't available. Because the version of you that was present wasn't quite the version that needed to be seen. This is how loneliness lives inside crowds. Not as isolation, as proximity without contact, and it leaves a specific kind of exhaustion. Not tired from being around people, tired from the distance between who you are and who you were for the last 3 hours pretending to be. Before we go further, this is not a social failure. It is not introversion mismanaged. It is not a sign that you don't belong anywhere. It is a sign that you have a rich, specific, fully formed inner world, and that the standard terms of social interaction don't always give it room to land. People who experience this kind of crowd loneliness are almost never shallow people. They tend to be highly perceptive, emotionally layered, precise in the way they experience connection, meaning they know the difference viscerally between real contact and the performance of it. That precision isn't a liability. It's a form of depth. The problem isn't that you feel too much in these rooms. The problem is that you've learned, usually across years, usually starting earlier than you remember, to translate yourself downward, to make your inner experience smaller, quieter, more digestible for rooms that weren't built to hold all of it. And after enough translation, you stop arriving as yourself at all. You arrive as the edited version. And the edited version, however skillful, cannot be known. And a self that cannot be known even in a crowd, is a self that is alone. What you're experiencing has a precise name in psychology. It's called high self-monitoring, a concept first developed by social psychologist Mark Snyder in the 1970s and extensively studied since. Self-monitoring describes the degree to which a person regulates their behavior based on external social cues. High self-monitors are exceptionally good at reading rooms, at detecting what's expected, at adjusting performance in real time. In many ways, it's a sophisticated social skill, but it comes at a cost. Research by Snyder and others found that high self-monitors consistently report lower feelings of authenticity in social settings, not because they're being dishonest, but because the gap between their performed behavior and their actual internal state creates a measurable psychological strain. The brain, it turns out, notices that gap. There's a region of the prefrontal cortex involved in self-referential processing, sometimes called the medial prefrontal cortex, that is active when we're thinking about ourselves, our values, our genuine emotional state. When we're performing a version of ourselves that doesn't accurately reflect that inner state, this region registers a low-level conflict. Not dramatically, not consciously, but persistently, like a quiet frequency of wrongness running underneath a normal-seeming interaction. Over the course of an evening, that frequency accumulates. And by the time you leave the room, what you feel isn't post-social tiredness. It's the particular exhaustion of suppression, the neurological cost of maintaining a gap between what's true and what's being expressed. Here's the metaphor that makes this tangible. Imagine you're a musician, and every time you enter a room, someone hands you a different instrument than the one you play. You're not incompetent. You make it work. You produce something that sounds to the room like music. But inside, you know the notes are slightly wrong. You know the instrument doesn't match the song you actually hear. And after an entire evening of playing the wrong instrument, even beautifully, even convincingly, you walk out exhausted in a way that has nothing to do with effort. You're exhausted because you never got to play the right song. Now layer on a second mechanism. What psychologists call the need for cognitive consistency, our deep neurological drive to have our inner experience match our outer expression. When that match fails repeatedly, when who we feel ourselves to be and who we're allowed to be in a given space keeps diverging, the brain registers this as a form of threat. Not physical threat, identity threat. An identity threat over time produces a specific emotional signature, the sense that even in company, you are fundamentally, quietly, unreachably alone. So what do you do with this? Not how do you become more social? How do you become more present as yourself in the rooms you're already in? Here are 5 principles, each grounded in psychology. The first move is not self-correction. It's honest assessment. Not all rooms are equally capable of holding real connection. Some social environments are structurally shallow, designed for performance, not contact. Research on meaningful conversation by psychologist Matthias Mell found that people who engaged in more substantive, personal exchanges reported significantly higher well-being than those in frequent small talk, regardless of whether they identified as introverted or extroverted. The implication is clear. The depth of a room matters more than your behavior in it. What to do? Start noticing which rooms reliably leave you feeling emptier than when you arrived, and which ones, even occasionally, leave you feeling seen. Why it works. This reframes the problem from a personal deficit to an environmental mismatch. The brain responds differently to accurate environmental assessment than to self-blame. It activates problem-solving circuitry rather than shame. Real-life example. You have a large social group that gathers monthly. You also have one friend you see irregularly, one-on-one, where conversation goes to actual depth. Noticing that difference isn't antisocial, it's data, and it tells you where to invest. The performance sustains itself because it's never interrupted. You arrive edited. You stay edited. You leave edited. And nothing in the room gets the chance to respond to the real version because the real version never showed up. The intervention here is small and deliberate. Introduce one honest signal per conversation. Not a confession. Not a dramatic shift. One moment of genuine opinion. One real reaction. One thing you actually think, instead of the thing that keeps the conversation smooth. Why it works. Research on self-disclosure by psychologist Irene Altman describes intimacy as built through gradual reciprocal revelation. When you offer something real, even small, you open a door. Some people will walk through it. Those are the people the room actually contains. Real-life example. Someone asks if you've seen a recent film everyone's talking about. Instead of a neutral, "Yeah, it was good," you say what you actually thought about it, specifically. The response you get tells you something important about whether this person is capable of meeting you somewhere real. One of the most draining components of crowd loneliness is the sustained performance of ease. Looking comfortable. Looking engaged. Looking like this is where you want to be. The energy spent on that performance is energy that cannot go toward actual connection. What to do? Allow yourself small, honest adjustments. Step outside for a moment without explaining it. Sit quietly for 5 minutes without performing attention. Give yourself permission to be visibly, quietly okay with your own interiority. Why it works. This is rooted in what psychologist James Gross calls expressive suppression, the active inhibition of emotional display. Research consistently shows that suppression increases physiological stress and reduces the quality of social connection, because people unconsciously sense the gap between what's shown and what's felt. Releasing the performance, even partially, reduces that gap and paradoxically makes you more present, not less. Real-life example. At a party, you find yourself nodding through a conversation you've completely disengaged from. Instead of sustaining the performance for another 10 minutes, you excuse yourself. Step outside, breathe, and come back when something in you is actually available. The quality of your next conversation will be different. The instinct, when you feel socially disconnected, is often to see more people, more events, more attempts at belonging. But the research doesn't support frequency as a solution. What it supports is depth. Psychologist Robin Dunbar's work on social bonding suggests that genuine connection is produced not by how often we interact, but by the quality and emotional resonance of those interactions, including moments of shared vulnerability, genuine laughter, and real conversation. What to do? Consciously reduce the number of surface-level social events you attend out of obligation and increase the intentional, smaller interactions where real conversation is possible. Why it works. This targets the actual neurological source of belonging, the brain's oxytocin response, which is activated not by proximity but by felt emotional resonance with another person. Real-life example. You have 2 social options on a Saturday. A large casual gathering where you'll cycle through small talk for 3 hours. Or dinner with 2 people where conversation consistently goes somewhere real. Choosing the second isn't antisocial. It's neurologically smarter. When you're deep inside a performance, monitoring, adjusting, managing, it becomes very difficult to feel yourself. The anchor you need isn't external, it's internal. What to do? Identify one physical or mental signal that reconnects you to your actual state in the middle of a social moment. It could be a breath, a deliberate internal question. What do I actually think right now? Or even a simple physical grounding gesture. Why it works. This practice activates what psychologist Tara Brach and researchers in mindfulness neuroscience call present moment self-awareness, a shift in attention from the monitored external self back to the experiencing internal self. That shift, even brief, interrupts the suppression cycle and gives the authentic self a moment to orient. Real-life example. You're mid-conversation performing attention when you catch yourself. You take one slow breath and silently ask, what do I actually notice right now? Maybe you notice you're genuinely curious about something they said. You follow that thread. The conversation shifts. Something real enters the room. Here is the model to carry. Connection is not produced by presence. It's produced by contact. And contact requires two real things meeting. When you arrive in a room as an edited version of yourself, however skillfully assembled, however warmly performed, you can be surrounded and still be alone. Because the part of you that needs to be known is the part you left at the door. The work isn't to become more social. It's to become more honest in small, deliberate ways about who actually walked into the room. Audit the environments. Introduce real signals, release the performance. Choose depth over frequency. Anchor yourself back to yourself. Not all at once, not perfectly. Just enough that the room occasionally contains the actual you. And the actual you has a chance of being actually met. The loneliness you feel in those rooms is not a sign that you don't belong anywhere. It's a sign that you belong somewhere specific, in conversations that go past the surface, with people who don't need you to be smaller to feel comfortable. In moments where you don't have to translate yourself downward just to be understood. Those moments exist. They're rarer than the crowded rooms, but they're the ones you actually remember. The ones where you drove home and felt not drained, but somehow more yourself than when you left. That feeling is what you're looking for every time you walk into a room. And the way to find it more often is not to become better at performing. It's to become braver about arriving as yourself, unedited, willing to be miscalibrated, willing to be too much for some rooms. Because the right rooms and the right people within them will not ask you to be less. They'll meet you exactly where you are. And in that moment, surrounded by noise, by light, by all the ordinary texture of an evening, you will not feel alone.